The amber lights pulsed against the beige walls, silent, rhythmic, terrifying. Most people working in the Pentagon didn't even know what that specific flash pattern meant, but I knew exactly what it signaled. It meant a level 5 strategic asset had just gone dark, and I had exactly 4 minutes to initiate a containment protocol before the blackout became global. My heels clicked sharp and fast against the linoleum as I zeroed in on the heavy blast door at the end of Corridor C, the one marked with the terrifying red letters, restricted access, eyes only. I heard the heavy, chaotic thud of combat boots sprinting behind me before I heard his voice. My father, Colonel Robert Miller, a retired officer who still wore his high and tight haircut like a crown, was running after me in a blind panic. He wasn't worried about the national security crisis. He was worried about me embarrassing him. He lunged forward, grabbing my shoulder with enough force to spin me around, his face flushed with a mix of fear and humiliation. "Emily, stop. That's the war room, for God's sake," he screamed, his voice cracking so loud it echoed down the hall. "You're a secretary. Get back to the tour group before you get us both arrested." I didn't flinch. And I didn't apologize. I looked down at his hand on my blazer, the hand of a man who had spent 30 years underestimating me, and then I looked him dead in the eye. I brushed his grip off with a sharp, calculated motion that left him stunned, then I turned back to the door. I didn't swipe a badge. I didn't punch in a code. I simply leaned forward. The retinal scanner swept a beam of red light across my eye, chirped a happy confirmation tone, and the 6-inch steel bolts retracted with a heavy hydraulic hiss. The air inside was freezing, scrubbed clean by military-grade filtration. Around the massive digital table, 12 4-star generals were arguing over the blackout. But the moment I stepped across the threshold, the room fell silent. They didn't reach for their sidearms. They didn't call security. One by one, the Joint Chiefs of Staff stood up. General Hale, the chairman, looked past my shoulder at my father, whose jaw was practically on the floor. "Remove that civilian," Hale barked to the MPs. "The commander has the floor." To understand why my father looked like he'd just seen a ghost, you have to understand the morning we just had. 4 hours earlier, he had dragged me to the Pentagon for a legacy tour, a specialized ego stroke for retired officers to relive their glory days. He had spent the entire morning apologizing for my existence. Every time we ran into one of his old service buddies, he would clap a hand on my back and offer the same condescending introduction with a forced smile. "This is Emily," he'd say, lowering his voice as if discussing a shameful medical condition. "She's in logistics. You know, administrative support. It's a steady paycheck, at least." He treated me like a confused tourist in the very building where I secretly commanded entire intelligence divisions. When we passed the Hall of Heroes, he actually stopped to explain to me what a Medal of Honor was, speaking slowly as if I were a child who couldn't grasp the concept of sacrifice. He had no idea that the boring desk job he mocked was a cover for a clearance level that didn't even exist when he was active duty. He saw a disappointment, but the government saw a weapon. He grabbed my arm thinking he was saving his clueless daughter from federal prison. He didn't realize he was physically assaulting the only person in the building authorized to stop World War III. To understand how he missed the signs, you have to understand the boring job I've been doing for 10 years. My father, Colonel Miller, a man who believed the measure of a human soul was weighted in brass and ribbons, lived his life in a world of black and white. In his mind, there were only 2 types of people: the warfighters who kicked down doors and the support staff who filed the paperwork after the dust settled. For 30 years, he had made it painfully clear which category mattered and which one I belonged to. To him, my lack of a uniform wasn't just a career choice. It was a character flaw, a sign that I lacked the grit to serve something bigger than myself. He had bought into my cover story with a dismissive ease that always stung more than I cared to admit. As far as he knew, I was a mid-level manager at a logistics firm in Northern Virginia, a boring corporate drone who spent her days tracking shipping containers and arguing over office supply budgets. He would ask me about my week with a glazed look in his eyes, nodding politely. As I muttered vague things about supply chains and efficiency reports, he never pressed for details because he simply didn't respect the answer. He assumed my biggest stress was a jammed printer, never realizing that the shipping containers I tracked were actually mobile ballistic missile launchers moving through hostile territory. The contrast became unbearable whenever my cousin came to visit. Mark, a fresh-faced second lieutenant who looked like a recruitment poster, brought to life, was everything my father had ever wanted in an heir. When Mark walked into the room in his dress blues, my father's posture would straighten, his face lighting up with a pride I had never been on the receiving end of. They would swap stories about boot camp and base housing, speaking in a shorthand of acronyms and shared experiences that effectively walled me out of the conversation. I would sit there, nursing a drink, listening to my father praise Mark's service while throwing me a pitying glance. "Emily's doing well too," he'd say, the enthusiasm draining from his voice. "She's keeping the private sector organized. Someone has to file those invoices, right?" I swallowed the insult, just like I swallowed the truth. I wanted to scream that I didn't file invoices. I filed the president's daily brief. I wanted to tell him that while Mark was learning how to lead a platoon during training exercises, I was directing multi-agency task forces through asymmetric warfare scenarios that were currently unfolding in real time. Technically, as a GS-15 civilian intelligence director, I held the protocol equivalent of a full colonel. I outranked my cousin by a decade of experience and 3 pay grades, but in my father's house, rank was only visible if it was pinned to your chest. The tension came to a head during the tour, right as we paused in front of a marble memorial dedicated to Cold War operations. My father stopped the group, his voice taking on that preaching, lecturing tone he reserved for me. He started talking about the silent sacrifices of the men who stood on the wall, gesturing grandly to the names engraved in stone. "You see, Emily," he said, turning to me in front of his friends, "this is what commitment looks like. It's not about a paycheck or a 401k. It's about putting your life on the line when nobody is watching." As he spoke, my phone vibrated against my thigh. 3 distinct urgent pulses. It wasn't a text, it was a critic alert. The highest priority notification the intelligence community possesses. I slipped my hand into my pocket, my fingers brushing the screen. I didn't need to look to know what it meant. A rogue satellite network had just gone dark over the Pacific, blinding our early warning systems in a volatile region. This was a flash override scenario. While my father was lecturing me on the abstract concept of duty, I was mentally running through the containment protocols for a potential nuclear standoff. I could feel the cold sweat pricking at my hairline, the adrenaline dumping into my system, sharpening my vision. "Are you even listening?" My father snapped, misinterpreting my focus. "I'm trying to teach you something about history." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the medals he polished every Sunday, the pride he wore like armor, and the absolute, total ignorance behind his eyes. He was talking about history. I was trying to prevent the future from ending. I felt the crushing weight of my non-disclosure agreement, a legal gag that turned my life's work into a secret shame. I wanted to pull out my phone, show him the alert, and watch his world shatter. I wanted to tell him that sacrifice isn't always about dying in a muddy trench. Sometimes it's about living with the knowledge that you saved the world, and you can't tell a single soul, not even your own father. But I didn't. I just clenched my hand around the phone, the metal digging into my palm. "I'm listening, Dad," I said quietly, my voice tight. "I know more about sacrifice than you think," he scoffed, turning back to his friends with a shake of his head. "Sure, honey. I bet the logistics world is brutal." My father measured respect in ribbons and salutes. He didn't understand that in modern warfare, the most dangerous people in the room are the ones wearing business casual. The cafeteria noise was deafening, a chaotic mix of clattering trays and low chatter. But it all vanished the second my phone vibrated against the table. It wasn't the polite buzz of an email, it was the relentless, jarring pattern of a flash override. I glanced down, shielding the screen from the prying eyes of the tourists around us. The rogue satellite wasn't just drifting anymore, it had locked onto a friendly grid, and the timeline for interception had just collapsed from hours to minutes. Then came the text from General Hale, the letters glowing urgent and white against the black background. "Assets blind. We need eyes. GET to the NMCC. Now." I didn't finish my coffee. And I didn't wait for a lull in my father's story about his glory days. I stood up, the chair scraping loud and harsh against the linoleum floor. The Emily who nodded politely at insults evaporated, replaced instantly by the director. "I have to go," I said, my voice dropping an octave, stripping away every ounce of warmth. Stay here. It wasn't a request, it was a tactical directive, given to a subordinate. My father blinked, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, stunned by the sudden insubordination. Excuse me? He sputtered, his face flushing red. Emily, sit down. You can't just wander off in the Pentagon. You don't have the clearance to go to the bathroom without an escort, let alone... I was already moving. I turned on my heel and hit the main corridor at a brisk, purposeful pace, my mind already calculating the quickest route to the National Military Command Center. I heard him scramble up behind me, his heavy footsteps clumsy against the polished floors. Get back here, he hissed, trying to keep his voice down but failing miserably. He was terrified, not of the global crisis unfolding on my encrypted server, but that his civilian daughter was about to wander into a restricted zone and stain his reputation. I took a sharp left toward the service elevators, bypassing the tourist route entirely. My father struggled to keep up, breathless and angry, shouting about maps and protocols he hadn't read in 20 years. I knew every blind corner, every sensor blind spot, and every shortcut. In the E-ring, better than I knew the floor plan of my own apartment. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. Honestly, I barely registered his presence anymore. He was just background noise. Static on a secure line that I needed to clear. He thought I was lost, panicking and making a fool of myself. I wasn't running away from him. I was running toward the one place where his opinion didn't matter, and my commands were absolute law. The hallway finally ended at the blast doors, and my father's patience ended with it. He lunged past the no loitering line, waving his arms at the armed military police officers stationed there, frantically trying to preemptively apologize for what he thought was my breakdown. "Officer, my daughter is confused," he shouted, his voice echoing off the reinforced steel like a gunshot. "She's having an episode. I'll handle this. She doesn't know where she is." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face a mask of absolute mortification. "Emily, step away from that scanner right now before you ruin your life." I didn't even turn my head. I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him, a familiar burning sensation that used to make me shrink into myself. But today, it just felt pathetic. I stepped up to the biometric reader, the laser mapping my retina in a fraction of a second. The heavy hydraulic lock disengaged with a sound like a cracking whip, followed by the deep, pressurized hiss of the seal breaking. My father stopped mid-shout, his mouth hanging open as the massive door swung inward, revealing the chaotic hum of the National Military Command Center. Inside, the room was a wall of noise, phones ringing, analysts shouting, coordinates, the hum of massive server banks processing global threats. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted violently. General Hale, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man my father had worshipped from afar for decades, looked up from the central map table. He saw me, and his posture snapped rigid. "Room, attention," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. The effect was instantaneous. 50 highly trained officers froze in place, silence slamming into the room with physical force. My father, standing in the doorway behind me, instinctively snapped his heels. Together, his chest swelling with a reflex honed over 30 years of service. He actually smiled. A small, confused smirk of validation, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, his rank still held sway here. He thought the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was acknowledging him. General Hale marched across the room, his medals chiming softly against his chest. He walked right past my father, didn't even blink at him, and stopped directly in front of me. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Hale spoke. "Director," he said, using my operational title with a deference that seemed to suck the air out of my father's lungs. "The bird is dark. We have total signal loss over the Pacific grid. What are your orders?" I didn't look at my father. I couldn't afford to. I walked past the general to the main console, my fingers flying across the tactical keyboard as the massive screens turned from amber to red. "Initiate protocol blackout immediately," I commanded, my voice steady, amplified by the sudden quiet of the room. "Reroute the signal through the secondary node in Guam. I want a localized jamming frequency on the southern border of the grid. If they can't see us, they can't target us." I paused, finally turning back toward the entrance where my father stood. frozen like a statue of a man whose entire worldview had just crumbled. He looked small. He looked terrified. He looked at me not as his disappointment, but as a stranger who spoke a language of power he couldn't comprehend. I turned back to General Hale, my face impassive. "And General? Clear the entryway. We have unauthorized civilians in the secure zone. This is a level 5 operation." 2 military police officers, both majors, ranking officers who would have normally saluted my father, stepped forward and gripped his arms firmly. "Sir, you need to come with us," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You do not have the clearance to hear what she is saying." My father didn't fight them. He just stared at me, watching as the generals leaned in to hear my next command. Watching as the blast door slowly began to close between his world and mine. He wanted a soldier for a child. He got a commander. And as the MPs escorted him out, he finally realized that the desk job he mocked was the reason he was still sleeping safe at night. The silence that falls over a command center after a crisis is averted is heavier than the noise of the panic itself. For 4 hours, the room had been a cacophony of shouting voices, ringing phones, and the hum of cooling fans pushing overdrive to keep the servers from melting. Now, the only sound was the low, steady rhythm of the air recyclers and the soft click of keyboards as analysts began the tedious work of documentation. I stood at the central console, watching the main screen turn from a terrifying blinking crimson back to a steady, reassuring blue. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the crash that comes after running on pure adrenaline and caffeine for half a workday. General Hale walked up beside me, his presence looming large even in the quiet. He didn't offer a medal or a speech. Men like him knew that the job was its own reward, and silence was the highest form of praise. He simply placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture of respect that felt more grounding than any award ceremony my father had ever dragged me to. "Good work, Director," he said, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "We stabilized the grid." The secondary node held. He paused, looking toward the blast doors where my father had been escorted out hours ago. "Tell your father I said goodbye. I don't think we'll be seeing him on the visitor logs again." I walked out of the secure zone and into the late afternoon sun, the sudden brightness stinging my tired eyes. The transition was jarring, stepping from a world where I held the fate of nations in my hands back into the mundane reality of a Virginia parking lot. My father was waiting by his car, leaning against the driver's side door with a posture that looked defeated. He looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the bravado that usually armored him against the world. Around his neck, the bright yellow visitor lanyard dangled uselessly. The VIP access badge had been cut off, leaving only a jagged plastic edge, a physical mark of his revoked status. He saw me approaching and straightened up, instinctively trying to reassemble the hierarchy that had governed our lives since I was a child. He opened his mouth, and for a second, I braced myself for the yelling, for the lecture on decorum, for the indignation. But it didn't come. Instead, he looked at the ground, shuffling his feet like a cadet caught out of uniform. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice thick with a mix of embarrassment and accusation. You should have told me, Emily. You let me walk in there blind. You let me make a fool of myself." I stopped a few feet away from him, keeping a distance that felt like a canyon. I looked at this man, my father, the colonel, the hero of his own story, and I waited for the anger to rise. I waited for the resentment that had burned in my chest for 20 years to flare up. I thought about the Christmas dinners where he interrupted my stories to talk about my cousin's basic training. I thought about the time he told my high school guidance counselor that I was better suited for support roles than leadership. I tallied every interrupt, every eye roll, every dismissive pat on the head in a mental ledger that was pages long, and I felt nothing. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, serene clarity. "I couldn't tell you, Dad," I said, my voice calm and level, devoid of the pleading tone I used to use when I wanted his approval. "That is the point of the clearance. It's not a secret club for show, it's the law." He looked up, his eyes flashing with a weak flare of his old defensiveness. "But I'm your father, I'm family. You could have given me a hint. You let me treat you like..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because the truth was too ugly to speak aloud. "You treated me the way you saw me," I finished for him, leaning back against the concrete barrier. And frankly, Dad, you never asked. In 10 years, you asked me about my commute. You asked me about my benefits package. You asked me if I was dating anyone. But you never once asked me what I actually did. You just assumed. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and final. He opened his mouth to argue, to rewrite history the way he always did, but the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel cut him off. A sleek, black government SUV pulled up to the curb, the tinted windows opaque and impenetrable. The driver, a young captain in full uniform, stepped out and opened the rear door for me, standing at rigid attention. My father looked at the car, then at the driver, and finally back at me. The reality of the situation settled over him like a shroud. He wasn't the protagonist of this story anymore. He wasn't even a supporting character. He was a bystander. I didn't offer to give him a ride. I didn't offer to grab dinner later to smooth things over. The bridge hadn't just been burned. It had been demolished by tactical ordnance. I have a debrief at the White House, I said, checking my watch. The president needs a summary of the outage before the evening news cycle. I stepped toward the open door of the SUV, pausing just long enough to look back at him one last time. You can take the metro home. The station is just across the lot. I climbed into the back seat, the leather cool and smelling of conditioned air. As the door thudded shut, sealing me inside the quiet capsule of my real life, I watched him through the tinted glass. He was standing alone on the curb, a graying man in a polo shirt, staring up at the massive fortress, like walls of the Pentagon, a building that respected his daughter more than he ever had. My father spent his life chasing medals to pin on his chest. I learned that the most powerful victories are the ones you never speak about. If you're the quiet professional in a loud family, let me know in the comments. We know who really runs the world.